Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues before the country. Well, one issue that is back on the front burner after a brief hiatus is the issue of trade facilitation and food subsidies. With the US reportedly all set to put pressure on Prime Minister Narendra Modi during his maiden visit to that country to end what it calls India's blockage of a trade pact globally, it's time to get to the bottom of it all. And who better to do that with than two of the biggest names in trade and agriculture, Abhijit, head of the Center of WTO Studies at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi, and Ashok Gulati, former head of the Commission of Agricultural Costs and Prices and presently with ICRIER, the New Delhi-based think tank. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Agriculture, Abhijit, has been a big issue really in India, and the point is that there is a huge debate about whether India is really playing spoilsport. After all, TFA, that is trade facilitation, is good if you remove red tape, if you make trade, global trade grow faster. The objectives are certainly very laudable. So why is India creating any problems at all? That is my first question. And my second is that does this really jeopardize the future of the WTO at all?
Mythili, what we need to recognize is that India is not opposed to trade facilitation agreement per se. Way back last October, when at that point in time newly elected Director General Roberto Azevedo visited India, that time itself India had signaled that it did not have too much of problems with trade facilitation. But the recent impasse that we've witnessed and that continues to persist is not because of trade facilitation. You're right, trade facilitation might end up in cutting the red tape, but the problem lies elsewhere. The problem lies in India's scheme of minimum price support for rice, wheat, and other crops. If we look at the numbers, particularly in respect of rice, India is likely to breach what's called product-specific de minimis limit, which is 10% of the production of rice. Now, this issue has been agitating the mind of Indian negotiators right from, I would say, 2004, 2005 onwards. And in 2008, some sort of a consensus appeared to be evolving on this issue. However, come 2012 November, it seemed as if this issue would not be adequately addressed. So when preparations for the Bali ministerial meeting started last January or February, there was a concerted attempt made by India and a few other developing countries, commonly called G33 countries, to see that this problem of food subsidies was not left by the wayside and was addressed along with the trade facilitation agreement. So when we reached Bali, we had two decisions. One decision was that the trade facilitation agreement, an important milestone would be end of July, when something called the protocol amending the Marrakesh agreement would be endorsed by all countries. And along with that, there would be some discussions, negotiations on how to reach a permanent solution to this problem of food subsidies. And in the interim, till a permanent solution is found, what the ministers decided at Bali was something what is called a due restraint clause. In other words, countries would not raise a WTO dispute against India if it breached its WTO obligations in respect of food subsidies.
Peace, what they call the peace clause.
What's commonly called the peace clause. Okay. But along with this peace clause, there was a commitment to negotiate further on the permanent solution. The peace clause was only an interim measure. What happened after Bali till July was that while considerable progress was made on finalizing the TF protocol, almost no negotiations took place on this issue of moving towards a permanent solution. So essentially, India's being recalcitrant on the TF protocol is an articulation of the fact that no movement or no meaningful engagement has been visible so far from many of the WTO members on moving towards a permanent solution.
So that really is a connection, Ashok, between trade facilitation and food subsidies. But tell me, isn't it in our own interest to cut our food subsidies? So if we have some external reason, because in India the political economy is such that on our own it becomes very difficult for us to cut food subsidies. But just like we were able to lower our tariffs, citing the WTO, wouldn't this be a very good reason for us to cut food subsidies? So why don't we grab this opportunity really?
First, we have to be clear that food subsidy given to consumers has no problem. Depending upon your pocket, you keep giving whatever you want to do. So there is no, that's all going in the green box. But the problem arises if you are giving to your farmers a much higher support price than what the external reference price is. That's where the problem starts coming, and what Abhijit is saying, that that was reaching about 6–7% of the, in case of rice, all others are still way below. So there could be in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years you may breach. So the concern is on the producer pricing side, not on the food subsidy per se. So that is first part of the game. Second, even in the producer part of the game, if you play it smartly, how best you can judge if you want to give per hectare subsidy to the farmer rather than through product specific higher procurement prices, because these higher procurement prices practically, having seen in those corridors and sitting on that chair, basically operate in, earlier it used to be only 3 states, nowadays it is maximum 5 states. Punjab, Haryana, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. These are latest 2 entrants into the game. What about the rest of the crops? In fact, they are distorting the incentives for the other crops. And some states go for an extreme highly bonus, which they show that they are very close to the farmers, which I salute them for. But why, if they are giving a bonus on wheat or rice, why not to pulses growers or oilseed growers, of which we are so short of? So you have an incentive structure within agriculture through these policies, which is tilted in favor of wheat and rice. And I think we need to correct that. You can do it smartly, give them on per hectare basis, which is crop neutral, so you will have no problem at all. Actually, even when you are giving a higher price, the biggest issue that the world is concerned about is when you are holding 80 million or 70 million tons of stocks, and then suddenly a cabinet decision is taken to liquidate 15 million tons, at what price you are going to unload, especially in the international market. That is what disturbs them most, because then you are hitting someone else's interest. China's prices are way above our MSP, way above. You know, we are giving for wheat $225 a ton roughly, right? At present for wheat, external reference price is $264 a ton, which has another story in itself. But all said and done, Pakistan is giving $280 a ton, China is giving $388 a ton. But they are not distorting the international market by, if China is holding almost 200 million tons of stocks, but they are not offloading in the international market at a lower price.
So Abhijit, the problem really is that of trade distortion, is it? So if we were not to distort the trade, that means if we continue to hold on to the stock, which would also be very expensive of course, would that be okay by WTO? Would that be okay by the developed world?
Mythili, before I answer your question, let me mention one very important point. The negotiating stand of the government is based on the existing policy, number one, or the roadmap for a future policy. At this juncture, the existing policy is the MSP policy. We do not yet have a roadmap for reforming the MSP policy. So the government has rightly tried to ensure that through the WTO negotiations, the MSP policy does not get unraveled. There could be very genuine reasons for reforming the MSP operations, but those have to be dealt domestically. Till there is a domestic consensus on how the MSP scheme will be fine-tuned or maybe totally replaced by what Dr. Gulati mentions as a per hectare subsidy, government has no option but to continue with a negotiating stand that is in line with its current policy objectives.
Does the answer lie in reforming the MSP, Ashok? You've been, the architect of the MSP policy for the past few years, and you have been arguing very vehemently that actually we need to correct the terms of trade. So is the problem, is the villain really the MSP policy? What should we do?
That's a bigger question, and it's an entire food security complex that needs to be revisited and reformed and redesigned. You cannot touch just MSP when you have a huge public distribution system, when you have a National Food Security Act already passed in the Parliament where you are going to be distributing 61 million tons of food grains. How are you going to procure?
Well, Ashok, I'm afraid I will have to interrupt you there because it's time to shift into a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we are discussing this really contentious issue of trade facilitation and food subsidies. Ashok, just before the break, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but you were saying that one needs to look at the entire issue of food security, which brings me to the very next question. Is food security the same as food subsidies, or are the two quite distinct?
Food security, normally when they define at least 3 or 4 segments of it, components they define. First is making sure that there is enough food, availability part. Second is, even if it is available, you must have economic access to it. There would be people who may not be able to afford at that price. Third is absorption. Even when you take food, you may not be able to absorb because you are not having safe drinking water or diarrhea problem and so on and so forth, sanitation. And the last is the stability of the food system. These are 4 components of food security as such. Now, food subsidy is primarily to give you economic access to food. That's what we are trying to do. We are trying to say, okay, the poor will have rice at 3 rupees and wheat at 2 rupees, and 67% of India will have that. 75% in rural areas and 50% in urban. Once you have that system and 61 million tons have to be distributed, you have to procure it. Now, to make sure that you are able to procure it, either you go and compete in the market and try to buy that, or give them some support price, and that is what creates a problem because MSP keeps on rising over a period of time.
In fact, Abhijit, you had a point over there that you are kind of feel that the MSP policy has to be maintained, whereas Ashok seems to suggest that let the government compete along with private traders and procure. So isn't that a better market-driven system?
Mythili, what I'm saying is, as long as the MSP policy is in place, until we do not have a roadmap for reforming the MSP policy, the government is duty bound to defend it in the WTO negotiations. I'm not passing a judgment right now on whether MSP policy is good or bad, but let me go back to the issue of exports from FCI stocks distorting market. I think it's slightly wrong impression that has been created world over. If we look at the prices at which wheats were exported from the FCI stock, the year in which the maximum exports from wheat took place was around 2010 or 11. That year, the price at which the international tenders were sought for wheat, that was at least 34 to 35% higher than the MSP, minimum support price for wheat. So if you compare the price at which wheat got exported with the MSP for wheat for that year, I really would tend to disagree that if the price at which the tenders were floated was about 33–34% higher than the MSP, exports of wheat from India is distorting the global markets. I do have a bit of difficulty in that. The point was that
I think India is exporting at lower than international price. Isn't that where the distortion arose?
You see, I think we have to get what our perception is or what our arguments are vis-a-vis what US or many others are carrying those arguments. Their argument is that your cost of procuring, storing, let us say wheat today, economic cost is 20 rupees a kg. There is another 4 rupees 75 paisa, 78 paisa for carrying the buffer. So literally 25 rupees a kg. Now if you are selling it, let us say at 18 rupees, that is below the cost, and that is not done because that is literally dumping. Now what Abhijit is saying, and I also put that argument forward, that you are giving to your farmer only 14 rupees. So long as you are selling at 18 rupees, you are fine. But that's not the argument of our other negotiators on the other side of the table. They say it is costing you 25 rupees and you are selling at 18. So there is a loss you are incurring from the FCI costs. So that's where I think there is going to be this argument on the table from the other negotiators.
Are our food subsidies distorting international trade, Abhijit? Would you agree they are distorting, or would you say that they are not distorting international trade?
Of course they are not distorting international trade. Very fact that we are exporting at a price which is higher, substantially higher than MSP, I think that's a sufficient argument to certainly assert convincingly that our food stock exports are not distorting international
Are you
trade.
convinced by that argument,
Well,
Ashok?
you know, this is the argument I also give, but that's not the argument acceptable to the other. Ultimately, Committee on Agriculture will have to look at it in WTO.
If, sorry to interrupt Dr. Gulati, if you look at the definition of dumping, and that's what some countries might allege, dumping is the difference between the price at which you sell domestically and the price at which you export. In this case, if the MSP is about, if the export price is about 34–35% higher than the MSP, it just does not meet the requirement of dumping. So while the other countries might argue that we are distorting, I would find it difficult to believe.
The question is, if you are selling it at a cost lower than what it is costing you, and to FCI it costs 25 rupees a kg, and you are selling at 18 rupees, that's where the problem starts coming in. How do you define? You define 14 rupees what the farmer gets, or you define below the cost sale by FCI. No private sector would like to sell at below the cost, but FCI does sell below the cost. And that's where the issue is on the table.
Certainly it can be contentious.
So we'll come back to this issue, but I'm afraid at this point we have to take another short break. But please do bear with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the issue of trade facilitation and food subsidies. Abhijit, you know, it is not India alone which has subsidizes its food. The US subsidizes, Japan subsidizes, Europe subsidizes. So why is it that only in India's case we are seen as this big spoiler of the entire WTO talks?
The way US subsidizes food is through food stamps, and the scheme of food stamps has been protected under what is called the green box. India seeks to achieve the same objective, but through different policy instruments, and that is where the problem arises. So essentially, both India and US meet the same objective, but through different goals. What US does is protected, whereas what India does really is not protected. So that is where the problem really lies. And what India is attempting to do is to ensure that its MSP scheme gets protected under the green box.
So, Ashok, is it essentially a question of just putting it in the right way, giving it the right garb, as it were? Because if we also can we continue with these subsidies, but just name them differently, would that allow us to kind of get away, quote unquote?
It's not just naming them differently.
Okay.
Undergraduate economics told you, if you want to help the farmer or the consumer, use an income policy instrument. What we are trying to do, we are using price policy instrument to give subsidy, which is an equity approach, right, through price policy. We will mess up the markets. The simple undergraduate economics is that if you want to do equity objectives, let it be through income policy, and price policy's job is getting efficiency, allocation of resources more. That's the fundamental difference. Now, all those countries that you named, US or Europe or Japan, they are gradually moving. They used to do price policy and distort the world markets. Over 30 years, 40 years, they have seen what the implications of that are, and they have reformed the system or are in the process of reforming towards income subsidy, which is less trade distorting. We are still stuck in the past. I think we have to learn what the international best practices are to help our own people. Nobody will dispute that you want to help your people, but help it in a manner which does the least distortion to the markets, and that is an income policy. For the consumers, give cash transfers, coupons, whatever you want to give, and to the farmers, give on per hectare basis and be crop neutral. That's the best way to go. One possibility is we should have used this WTO opportunity to streamline our entire thing. Now, it may take 2 years, 3 years to do that. It cannot be done overnight. You had a peace clause to protect you up to 2017. You could have done that if you want. But if you don't want, you want to protect your old system, well, you may fight in the system, you may fight alone in the system. And that's what has happened. India is literally cornered. And I think we have to find a smart way of achieving our ends and still looking in the global community of nations that we are a responsible and we will
so that we are not always seen as a spoiler.
Spirit.
Yes.
Because, you know, distortions have to be reduced. That's the ultimate objective of WTO agreement on this. Now, if you want to show, no, I want to distort even more, then you will run into a lot of trouble.
Abhijit, would you agree with that, that the way to go really is to give income support, and if you extend Ashok's argument, that means do away with the minimum support price. Have we run out of the minimum support price utility? Would you agree that scrap it, move to income support, that will be acceptable, it will be less trade distorting, it will be less price distorting, so domestically as well as internationally it's a much better way to go forward?
Let me pose a counter question to that. If we have to move towards income support, sounds good. But practically on the ground, to whom will you give income support? The land belonged to, let's say, a farmer 40 years back. He passed away. The state from where I come, Bihar, the land records are in a mess. So his grandsons may be, in a way, farming over there, or they may be absentee landlords. So will you give that per hectare support to that old man who died 40 years back, or to his 2 grandsons who are there, or to the person who is actually tilling the land? So the real practical problem in giving income support is how do you identify the relevant and the correct beneficiary? I'm sure means can be found to address this issue. If we are able to address this issue, then yes, there could be a possibility of gradually, in a way, making reforms to our MSP system. Having said that, till we move to that system, I'm afraid MSP has to continue. Remove MSP, suddenly what will happen? In all likelihood, the incentive to the farmer to produce will fall, production will fall. Can you imagine a situation when the rice production in the country dips? India has to go to the global market to purchase rice. Rice markets have very, very few exporters and very small quantity of rice is exported. And India is one of the major rice exporters. Remove India from the rice market and I guess about anything between 20 to 25 million tons of rice is exported. And if India enters that market, you can imagine the chaotic price surges that will arise. With those chaotic price surges, the supposed benefit to consumer that might happen will be wiped out.
Ashok, Abhijit seems to suggest that MSP actually benefits a poor farmer, but my understanding, correct me if I am wrong, is that MSP actually benefits a large farmer with marketable surplus.
Of course.
So who are we trying to protect?
The largest farmers of Punjab and Andhra.
So if we were to do away with MSP...
So what you are doing is anti-equity.
Absolutely.
You are helping the richest of the peasantry.
So if we do away with MSP, it would not have these consequences?
You know, the issue is that you cannot get away overnight. There has to be a transition over a period of 3 years. And first thing is you have to allow the private sector to buy in stock. Most of the private sector is, have you seen any private sector silos? No. You put export bans, you know, you put levies, so you have to clean up all the mess from the domestic market to get the markets operating in an efficient manner. Then don't worry, I think the incentives to the farmers will be better, not lower. In fact, if you want to see the implications of MSP, go in Bihar and see what a mess it is there. They are selling at 20% below the MSP, and because of many other factors. So you need to put a system and try to get the markets right, right? On the income policy, as there is a problem of consumer end, because many people don't have bank accounts. Why have you started Jan Dhan Yojana? That's the way even land records will have to be rationalized and computerized. So there is a period of 2 years, 3 years that you will have to prepare yourself.
I'm afraid we're coming almost to the end of our program. Abhijit, I'll give you the last word in this, because Ashok says it'll take some time. But we have 2007 till 2017 under the peace clause. So isn't that enough to kind of remedy, modify your MSP?
I doubt whether 4 years is adequate. As Dr. Gulati himself said, land records are in a mess. I don't envisage a situation where at least 6 to 7 years, it would take at least that to make changes in land records. Till we do that, we will have to perforce continue with MSP and perforce seek to agitate at the WTO to ensure that our concerns on MSP and product-specific support is adequately addressed.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this discussion. Clearly, it seems Abhijit seems to suggest that we'll have to fight it if necessary alone. Ashok has a slightly different point of view, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition. Thank you so much, Abhijit. Thank you, Ashok, also.
Thank
you for watching, but we'll be back next week, same time, with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.